So, I'm so excited to be here in person. And on behalf of the Adult Ed Committee, I just welcome you all here. My name is Alan Grant. So my name is Alan Knapp, and I'm representing the Adult Education Committee. We have two persons who need no introduction. We have Dr. Buchanan, our pastor emeritus, after serving for 24 years here at Fort Church. And we have Tom Dozman, an Old Testament scholar, professor at United Theological Seminary. So, with that, I'm going to just do a quick prayer and then get us started. The only logistical announcement I have is that we have to make a brief break between our two speakers so we can change microphones. So, just be ready for that, and I'm going to pray us into this time. If you would pray with me. God of all creation, we thank you for the opportunity to gather together in person and explore your word. Guide us to hear what you intend. Be inspired by each other and by David's story, and respond to your steadfast love in all that we do. Amen.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you all. I'm surprised. We've got pretty good competition at noon today in Soldier Field, and I really thought maybe people would elect the Packers and Bears, but I'm very, very grateful for your presence. And can I take this thing off? Yes. Oh, that feels good. And what a joy to connect with Tom Dozman again. Professor Dozman is a distinguished Old Testament scholar, and I just love being in conversation with him. I learned so much, and he's a lot of fun too. So this has been a great experience. This is our third go around, and I've just loved it. So we're going to begin today 3 sessions. The rise of David is first, and then the second, confirmation of David, and then the third one will be the beginning of David's fall. So, the rise of David. You will remember perhaps Joseph Heller, author of the best-selling Catch-22. Well, Heller wrote a book, God Knows, that nobody knows about except me, I guess. It's the story of David told in the first person. And it's, as Heller always is, funny and witty. He's been very careful with the text. He's totally irreverent, occasionally pretty raw, so be warned. Near the beginning, David says, I don't like to boast, but I honestly think I have the best story in the Bible. Where's the competition? Job? Forget him. Old Sarah's fine. She laughed and lied to God, and I still get a big kick out of that. But where's the action once you get past Isaac and Hagar? Joseph is pretty lively, but he drops out kind of suddenly, doesn't he? Now, Moses isn't bad, I have to admit, but he's very, very long. The story goes on, and with all those laws, who could listen to so many laws? I've got much better lines. I've got the poetry and the passion, savage violence, and the plain, raw, civilizing grief of human heartbreak. I could live forever on my famous elegy alone. So, the Saga of David, legendary king of Israel, slayer of Goliath, musician, poet, and hymn writer, David of the wandering eye, questionable morals and appalling behavior, brilliant military tactician, politician, husband, father, devastated, grieving father, David the man. This story occurs around 1000 before the Common Era, about 400 years after the Babylonian exile, 1,000 years, a millennium before the birth of Jesus, to place it in history. When the Hebrew people returned from Babylonian captivity to their homeland after 50 or 60 years, they were still a tribal society governed by judges. The people were not satisfied with that arrangement. They longed for a king. They want to be like all the other people around them. They want a king. So they ask Yahweh. The name of God in Hebrew, it's just 4 consonants, and Hebrew doesn't put in the vowels. We have to add the vowels. It's JHWH, and it was never written or pronounced by the ancient Jews. Anyhow, the people prayed to Yahweh to give them a king. They pray for a king, they long for a king, they beg for a king. They're warned that kings are not always a great idea, but they persist, and finally Yahweh tells Samuel, who is God's spokesperson, to find and anoint a king. And so Samuel anoints a man named Saul, Israel's first king. The beginning of this story is a shock to our delicate senses. A God very much like other Near Eastern deities, acting like a human being. In fact, in this instance, acting out the worst of our humanity. Here, this God is furious that Saul, who is chosen and anointed to be the first king of Israel, here this Saul has disobeyed God's specific command. And the command itself, sorry to say, is so appalling, we want to distance ourselves from it. Saul is ordered to lead the army of Israel in an attack on the Amalekites. The Amalekites are a tribe of nomads in the desert south of Canaan and Israel. A long time before, when the tribes of Israel were in the wilderness after the miraculous escape from Egyptian slavery, the Amalekites attacked them. Yahweh has a long memory, has not forgotten. And now he has a king and an army, and orders Saul to attack the Amalekites, kill them all, not just their soldiers, but citizens too, including the elderly, women and children, kill them all, even the livestock, the cattle, the camels, the donkeys, leave nothing alive. Well, the army of Israel defeats the Amalekites, but at the last minute, Saul has second thoughts and orders his men to spare and capture the best of the livestock, some of the jewelry, kidnap the Amalekite king, Agag. And God, Yahweh, is so angry that he regrets anointing Saul as king in the first place, lifts the blessing from Saul, and tells them it will be given to someone else. It's actually the prelude to David. Now, understandably, I'm going to take a little sidebar here. Understandably, we have a problem with a God that would do such a thing. This God sounds to me no better than a Taliban terrorist. The way I deal with this and with other instances in Hebrew scripture is by putting it in the context of theological evolution. The Jewish people's own theology evolved and changed over the centuries. 500 years after this, one of the great prophets of Israel would write, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. See, the Lord comes with might. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arm and carry them in his bosom and gently lead the mother sheep." I generally like modern translations, but that's not much an improvement on the older phrase and those that are with young. Well, Christian theology, this is a very different God from the one who orders a genocide. Christian theology thinks about God through the lens of Jesus, who we know as the Christ. Hebrew scripture is our scripture too. Hebrew scripture contains the Word of God, a word the Jewish people themselves came to understand as a word of love and forgiveness and reconciliation. So with that prolegomena, as they say, back to the story. God is angry, regrets making Saul king. The word comes to Samuel, who finds Saul and asks, "Why in the world didn't you obey? The Lord has taken the kingdom from you." And then another appalling incident: Samuel hews Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. 1 Samuel 16. The Lord sends Samuel to Jesse, Jesse the Bethlehemite, and says, "I have provided for myself a king among Jesse's sons." So Samuel arranges a little party, a sacrifice to the Lord, and he invites Jesse and his sons, and he's very impressed with the first one he sees, Eliab, and he says, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." Well, not so fast, Samuel. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." So Jesse brings the rest of his sons, Abinadab, Shammah, 7 in all, but the Lord has not chosen any of them. Samuel asks Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And Jesse said, "Well, there's one more, the youngest. You wouldn't be interested. He's just a boy. He's out tending the sheep." But David is brought, and the author of the account says, "Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome." So Samuel anoints David with oil in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Well, in the meantime, we've got a problem because Saul is still the king, and Saul is having a bit of trouble himself. He's tormented, tortured. He can't sleep. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, we're told, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. He can't sleep. He's frankly a wreck. The servant suggests that he might like to listen to some music and recommends one of the sons of Jesse, who's known to be skillful in playing the lyre. So Saul sends for David. David enters Saul's service and is appointed as Saul's armor bearer. Well, when the evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul, David played the lyre and Saul was relieved. This is the beginning of a complex, emotionally loaded, and ultimately very tragic relationship. In the meantime, the Philistines, Israel's ancient enemies, are encamped inside Israel and itching for a fight. The Israel army is prepared for battle. The scene is familiar: 2 mountains, an army on each one, with a valley between them, facing each other, formed in battle rank, ready to attack. Out of the Philistine camp comes a huge man, Goliath of Gath. He's 6 cubits and a span. Well, that cubit differs by culture, but it's generally about 18 inches, the distance from a man's elbow to middle finger. Goliath is described wearing a helmet of bronze, a heavy coat of mail, greaves of bronze on his legs. A greave is that piece of armor that goes down over the shin and lower leg. He's got a bronze javelin slung over his shoulder, large sword, and he shouts a challenge. "Choose a man to fight with me. If he kills me, we will be your servants. If I kill him, you will be our servants. Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." Well, the text says Saul and Israel were dismayed, greatly afraid. I guess so. I would be too. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse, David's oldest brothers, were in that Israel army. And David goes back and forth from serving Saul, who I see in a royal tent in the military encampment, going back and forth from that to his family's flocks to care for the sheep. For 40 days in that valley, there was a standoff. Goliath emerged from the Philistine camp and shouts his challenge. One day, Jesse sent David to the Israel camp with food for his 3 brothers. Parched grain, bread, and cheese for the commander. See how your brothers are doing, and come home and tell me. Well, David arrives at the encampment and finds the 2 armies lined up facing each other, prepared for battle. It sounds to me like time is about up on Goliath's challenge. There will be a battle and many will die. Both armies, we're told, are shouting the war cry. I see something like that amazing scene in Braveheart with the Scots on one side and the English on the other. But as David's talking with his brother, Goliath appears again and issues the challenge again. There's more fear and quaking now among the individual Israelites who are trying to challenge one another. Somebody's got to fight this man. They appeal first to patriotism. Have you seen how he is defying Israel? And then a less romantic appeal, but a very real one. The king will make the man who defeats Goliath very wealthy. In fact, he will give him the king's daughter. Little David asks, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And appeal now to both patriotism and religion. Funny how that seems always to happen. David's eldest brother overhears this, and there is fraternal friction and resentment. His older brother says, why have you come? With whom have you left the sheep? I know, you just came to see a battle. Well, Saul hears about all this and sends for David. And David appears in Saul's tent and tells Saul, I'll fight Goliath. Well, Saul dismisses that as silly talk. You're only a boy, and he's a warrior. David responds by reminding Saul that he fought off a lion and a bear to protect the sheep. He even rescued a lamb from the bear's mouth. Your servant, he says, has killed both lion and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who saved me from the lion and the bear will be with me. So Saul's out of options. He finally relents, puts his own armor on David, bronze helmet, coat of mail, strapped Saul's sword on. He's now looking just like Goliath, a lot smaller, and David can't even move. This is so bulky and heavy. So he takes it all off, takes his own staff, chooses 5 smooth stones from the wadi, the dry creek bed, puts them in his bag, and carries his sling in his hand. This is the very moment Michelangelo, by the way, chose to sculpt David in that famous work that stands in the Academy in Florence. David approaches Goliath, and Goliath has a hard time taking this seriously. He disdained David because he was only a youth. Goliath says to David, am I only a dog that you come to me with sticks? And he curses David by his Philistine gods. And then a final blood-curdling threat, come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. David, still full of confidence, righteous confidence, replies, you come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. God will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you dead, cut off your head, give your body to the birds and animals, so that all the earth may know there's a God in Israel. Notice how now this battle has taken on global, almost cosmic significance. The whole earth is going to find out about this. So Goliath lumbers into place to do battle. David, no doubt, surprising Goliath, runs straight at him. And before Goliath can draw that huge sword, David has placed one of the stones in a sling, whirled it around, released the sling and the stone hits Goliath in the forehead, and the giant goes down. And what comes next is graphically gruesome, I hate to tell you. David stands over the fallen man, takes Goliath's sword, and cuts his head off. The Philistines are shocked. They're now frightened. They retreat with the Israel army in pursuit. They, on the way, plunder the Philistine camp. And David carries Goliath's severed head to Jerusalem. Now, Saul's son Jonathan makes a brief appearance. We're probably going to talk about Saul a little bit later, or Jonathan. We're told, more or less out of the blue, that Jonathan loved David, was bound to David's soul, makes a covenant with David, gives David his robe and his sword. As you may know, there's much speculation about that relationship between David and Jonathan. The Bible doesn't hesitate to use the word love between these two young men, leading to much speculation about whether there is a sexual dimension to this love. But now a major pivotal point looms. David's fortunes are about to take off. David was successful, apparently, at everything he undertook. Saul promoted him to lead the army, and all the people, even Saul's advisors and family and servants, approved. Returning from his conquest of Goliath and subsequent military successes, David's reputation precedes him, and he is an instant, immediate, popular hero. Dancing girls with tambourines come out to meet the conquering hero, singing, "Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000. And you just know that that was not a good thing to happen, and it wasn't. Saul is still king, and raw jealousy and resentment enter the, until now, very happy story. Some political leaders, we learned recently, have a tendency toward petty resentment and revenge when they are superseded publicly and embarrassed. They have ascribed to David 10,000 Saul laments, and to me, thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom, my kingdom? The young hero, Saul thinks, has become a very real threat to his own leadership, maybe even his kingdom. And so, 1 Samuel 18:9, Saul eyed David from that day on. Now, Professor Dozeman, please tell us what in the world this is all about.
I was enjoying listening. Well, John's taken us through the first episode of the story of David. In the Hebrew Bible, story is theology. Right? Story is theology. So what's the point? What's the point? Is it nostalgic? Is it just really interesting? It's that everyone just couldn't put these stories away, so we're going to preserve them in Bible? No. David is at the heart of the Hebrew Bible, and he is so problematic. He is at the heart of the Hebrew Bible, and he is so problematic. Why? Well, we're not there yet, but the Hebrew Bible pivots on David. It goes through a, not reformation, it goes through a radical restructuring under David and introduces a new form of religion that we're not talking about today, but we ought to know why we're talking. What we're talking about today is getting us ready for what we're going to talk about, and that is that the God of the Exodus, who is a holy warrior God. That's very important to this story. John brought it up a ton of times. And it's so repulsive, but just stay with it. Grab that term because that's kind of important. Backs off. Yahweh backs off that activity and makes a promise to David whereby Yahweh loses freedom. Yahweh makes an unconditional promise of salvation to David. It's not in our story today, but you can't read today without that in the background. That is, Yahweh gives up freedom for the human and said, I choose you forever. Well, holy warriors don't do that, because you only care about people who show they got the grit to be with you. Holy war is a conditional view of religion. God is for you as long as you are willing to conditionally give yourself to God. And that jumpstarts God to enter your life. And the minute you take a stumble, have a doubt, don't kill the Amalekite king in holy war. I got other things to do, says the deity. You're out. You're out. Once saved, always saved in the world of holy war, not on your life. You are saved on the day you are faithful, and you're out of the game. If you were faithful on Tuesday and you stumble on Wednesday, God needs somebody else, and you're not in the wings anymore. You're gone. Right? That's called conditional covenant in the Bible. And it is powerful because it conforms to our religious experience. God, if I do X, can I trust you to do Y? And if I double down on faithfulness in doing X, can I plan on you? That's conditional religion, and most of us live by that most of the time because it makes sense to us. It's how we interact with people. But that's not what we get with David. The deity says, on Tuesday, I am electing you. I'm going to have a relationship with you. And by the way, you can't do anything to get out of it. It's permanent. I will give up freedom, whether you are scum of the earth or not. I'm staying with you. We call that unconditional covenant, and we as Presbyterians move around in both of these worlds. Although experientially we live in the first one more than we don't. It's really how our language of prayer tends to be conditional. But it's actually the weaker form of religion. It's the weaker form of faith. What you really want to do is bet the farm on a God that can't desert you, regardless of outcome. That's what you want. And that's why we baptize infants. Boom. Get that one out of the way. Get that one out of the way. Get that kid into the unconditional covenant, and we'll deal with the garbage later when they're teenagers. Do you see what I'm saying to you? That's very powerful religion, because you can go any place with that. Anything can happen to you with that. And you are in the hands of God. My little handout has conditional and unconditional salvation, and that's what I've just been reflecting on. And when I say story is theology, the story of David is meant to probe these two views of our religious relationship with God. And it's not negating one over the other. They're mixed around. The unconditional view of our relationship with God is what drives the Jesus tradition. That's why David's so important in Christian tradition. David is the son of, Jesus is the son of David. Now, I'm not sure what Jesus thought about that. I was reading the Gospels this week. A lot of time, COVID, why don't we read the Gospels? Mark and Matthew, Last words of Jesus on the cross don't sound very unconditional to me. My God, why have you forsaken me? Bang, dead. That's a conditional statement. God only shoves unconditional relationship in the life of Jesus in those two Gospels in his death. It's not until he's dead that unconditional kicks in. So that's very powerful. The other Gospels, they soften that a little bit. Jesus says some other things that seem like maybe he's not doubting so much. So let's take a move into David a minute, because the construction of the story of David is not really about personal piety. It's about collective identity and how the people of God collectively view their relationship. So when we talk about a king in the Hebrew Bible, we can talk about a person. But really what they're talking about is the nation state. Because who was a king in the ancient Near East? The state. Huh? It's called the divine right of kings. So when we get a story of David, these writers aren't talking simply about a character. They're talking about their corporate life and their existence, and whether it's reliable in relationship to God corporately. So we got to keep that dimension of this story in mind as we're reading these characters. They're bigger than characters. And I've given you a little schematic on this little handout. It doesn't make that much sense to me either as I look at it with you today. But the thing you have to see about the writing of the Hebrew Bible, these stories are written in larger compositions. Now, they're not unified compositions. Somebody has taken old traditions and this and that, but they have put them together so that story is theology. They're worried about something. They're not clear about something. And the story is going to be the resolution. So what I've given you there is Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. A lot of my colleagues view that all as one narrative, and they actually throw the book of Deuteronomy in front of it. And they call that the Deuteronomistic history. There'll be a quiz. All right? But what they mean by that is somebody's put this story together and something's bothering them. And somehow this story's got to address it. And tradition, the rabbis have decided they did it so well, we're going to canonize it. It's true for anybody and any time. So what is it we're supposed to get out of this story? You'll see where David, if you go down to the plot of the former prophets, the plot of the former prophets begins in the world of holy war. Begins in the world of the tribes. John mentioned that. Tribal Israel is a non-national, that's how it's presented to us. That's how the writer wants us to see it. Group of decentralized people who basically live religiously and politically and socially on episodic events of Yahweh invading their life every once in a while. Huh? Yahweh will invade Gideon's life, Joshua's life, any one of the judges. And when that happens, it's always in the context of war. Every story is about war. Why? They have a fetish about war? No, they want you to see that everything is at stake in a war. It's existence. So our existence is at stake. Now, where's God? And in the early stories, God can come or not come. God often goes away on vacation. What makes God enter the story. Somebody prompts it. That's conditional covenant. Somebody says, "Oh Lord, if you would, then I will risk everything for you." If then, wham, there comes God. And we get a war story. And it's always a war story of unequal odds. So the tribes, who are a rump group, usually have tremendous success because they don't fight anyhow in holy war. Yahweh is. That's the point. Holy war is a concept that isn't calculated about your preserving the life you have. It's an all-out, all-risk concept that you live for Jesus or you don't live. To hell with everything else. And if you can get yourself to that point, it will jumpstart God. Wham! You're supercharged. It's a violent trope in the Bible, but you got to see it for what it's trying to communicate. And that is, are you willing to bankrupt yourself today to follow God tomorrow? And who cares about retirement or, God forbid, health care? Welcome to the world of holy war. But if you're not willing to do that, then don't expect the deity to infiltrate your life, because you're hedging your bets. See, holy war is an all-out concept. All out. And it's not about preservation. It's about, well, then what do you want, God? Because I don't even know until you're in the story. It's a radical form of religion. It's strong and it's weak. Because in the end, the power of that God is kind of dependent on me. And if you believe that over and over and you follow that trope over and over, kind of your God is about as strong as you are. Wonder if you have a bad Tuesday and don't sell your net worth. You're gone. I'll get somebody else. You see, it's powerful and it's heroic, but it also kind of makes God weak. Even though God comes through, it's so powerful. Well, that's how the story of David begins. And I want to say one more thing, and I got to move on because we don't have much time, and I want to get John back up here. Who's writing this story? Who's writing this story? Well, we know who's writing this story. If you follow a historiography in the ancient world, and you want to know when it's being written, read the last paragraph. At least whoever that was wrote that last paragraph. Right? Well, the last paragraph of the former prophets, or the Deuteronomistic history, tells you exactly when it's being written. And I gave it to you. It's in the exile. The kingdom has been destroyed. It no longer exists. The Jerusalem temple doesn't exist. The king is a slave. The last king had his eyes popped out, but before they popped his eyes out, they killed all of his kids. Boom, there goes his eyes. There's an unconditional promise to David floating in the background here that we're not up to. The exile is get a new religion or do something, because an unconditional God didn't really come through that well. But this, whoever is writing this, something happens in the year 562, 561. There's a change of power. And our writer says there's a king, Evil Merodach, which is a pun. He's Avil Merodach. Obviously, our writer doesn't like him. But he changes slavery, exile policy, and takes conquered kings from jail and has them eat at one of the royal tables. That's what's prompting our writer. That's what our writer wants us to see. So on the one hand, there's this enormous doubt about the reliability of God and religion. And then there's this quirky thing. Who would have thought? Why are they pulling the Davidic king up out of jail? I better look at tradition again. You see? So our story is being written to, what do I do? I'm a migrant in Babylon. It all looks like it's a mess, but now they're feeding what's going on here? I am going to sift tradition and see how I got here in the first place. You follow me? So very quickly, John's already told us the story. The story of David begins in a world that has no unconditional religion. It only has conditional religion. It's the world of the tribes. They live by a conditional covenant. Their relationship with God is defined by holy war. The ark is the central cultic object by which the holy warrior wages war for them. And they call upon the holy warrior, I don't think Tom, during times of crisis. And if they are reckless in laying their cards on the table to Yahweh, Yahweh shows up. And literally all hell breaks loose. Conditional religion. Well, the reason that story goes on all through the book of Judges and up to the story of David is that those stupid tribes, they would go back home and, I don't know, they'd build up their retirement accounts again. They don't really want a holy war. They kind of like what they got. And so sure enough, the deity rejects them. Here comes another nation, it's going to wipe you out. And then, the deity doesn't care. The deity's not committed beyond commitment. Well, that's a reckless way to live, especially, as we all know, when the world changes. And the characters in the David story, and John brought this up, are the Philistines. The Philistines. The Philistines represent a nightmare to the tribes because they're Greeks. They come from Greece. They're sort of, kind of. And they're a fallout of a lost war. They're Europeans. And they live in an age that is more advanced than the world that the tribes live in. That is, when we talk about tribal Israel, read an introduction, my colleagues will write about the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age. You know what I'm saying? Well, what they mean by that is the highest technology is bronze. Very soft metal. The Philistines come from a culture that has advanced from bronze to iron. They have nuclear weapons. So when they hit the shores, and they're invaders, they almost take out the Egyptians. They have a new weapon that can't be stopped. It's the iron sword. There's a book on this by a scholar at Vanderbilt, a guy named Drew. The iron sword, the single sword, and notice how big it is in the story of Goliath. The iron sword. Well, that's like having a nuclear bomb. Of course you're not going to defeat them. They took out Egyptian chariots with swords. So what we have is the conflict of ages. And the tribes can't play that conditional world of religion even at its best anymore. That is, our writer is concerned about religion and change. What worked when I was 15 in Western Michigan, it just doesn't work in 2020 in Chicago. I can get nostalgic about it, but it's gone. And our writer is saying that. Our writer is setting up the story is theology. It's kind of nostalgic, but it's not livable. So David is introduced as a character who fulfills holy war. Our writer wants us to see that. He's an ideal character in the old age. How do you know that? Well, I suspect there's so many traditions in the libraries out of Jerusalem on David. Our writer picks so few. Actually, only 2 about early David. 3. Yeah. What? So the thing we want to know as readers of Bible, looking for the theology in the story, why did this author pick the stories we looked at today to introduce David? And what do they tell us about him, and how should we think about that? The first thing this author tells us, I think, is a little bit of a wild card. It's a little unexpected. Why is Saul picked as the first king? Because he's more handsome than the rest of us. And he stood a whole head above us. That is, in the world of conditional covenant, when power is conditional, which means I have to see the Spirit in you. If I don't see it in you, then it doesn't exist. We call that charismatic religion. You have to see the charism of the leader, which tells you the leader's filled with the Spirit of Yahweh. Well, who saw? Oh my gosh, bet the farm on the guy. And sure enough, he's genuinely religious. He's a great character to study because he's a tragic figure. He's a character who has all the right credentials but gets caught between the ages and can't make the transition. So he becomes really a suicide character. There's only a couple in the Hebrew Bible. So Saul, and the whole quest for a king, you have to realize how problematic this is. If indeed Yahweh is the king who saved you from the Exodus, why do you want a human king? That right there tells me you're hedging your bets. You have a king. And what do the elders say? No. Why not? Because of the Philistines. We can have all the faith in the world and they're going to take us out with nuclear weapons. We need to reconfigure. Now, are they saying, no, Yahweh's not powerful? That's not what they're saying. They're dealing with the problem of religion and change. And Samuel's a conservative, and he says, well, just run into the nuclear weapon and let the God of the Exodus, the holy warrior, neutralize the bomb, and you'll be fine. And they're all saying, I don't think so. So you see how the notion of the king is a problem. Don't let that go, friends, because this is right. That's this author's talking to us. The problem of the church and the nation state. This is what the writer's talking about. Beware of that one. Be very wary of that one. So Saul is the first shot at a charismatic, permanent ruler. He's not even called a melech. He's a nagid in Hebrew. Melech means king. He never becomes a king. He's just somebody who never had to go home and farm again. So we're in transition, a cultural transition, and which means he gets really good at holy war. And basically, he is a faithful holy warrior. We don't have time to crawl inside the text. Do it this week. These are great stories. What is this guy's downfall? What happened to him that he goes down the toilet? And the deity, and you have to read the text. Yahweh is the one who invades Saul to make him charismatic, and our writer does say an evil spirit invades him, but then you got to read the next line. That's Yahweh. Yahweh also turns on him. This is a God who's free, a very reckless God. What did he do? This horrible person. Well, he was going to fight. Who was it, John? Agag? I forget who he was going to fight. And it's holy war. He can't fight until a religious person says, yeah, go do it. And that religious person is Samuel. And he's got his whole army, which is a bunch of farmers with their hoes. And Samuel doesn't show up. And here's these Philistines with their iron swords. And he waits a day. Samuel doesn't show up. He waits several days. Samuel doesn't show up. Well, then he says, okay, I will sanctify this war myself for us, or we're going to all get killed. So he makes a sacrifice to Yahweh. He does. Samuel shows up the next afternoon and says, because you sanctified this battle, Yahweh has departed from you. This is very ambiguous stuff. He's a holy warrior. He's trying to be faithful. It's actually the religious guy that dropped the ball. He's a tragic figure. And that starts God, Yahweh, persecuting Saul. So it's still charismatic religion. He's still infused with the Spirit. The Spirit's nasty. Now what do? This is when we're introduced to our young character. There is this kid, who has this magical charismatic quality of the muse in the ancient Near East, that is the power of music to exorcise demons. And somebody says, hey, I heard of this kid. He can exorcise Saul. So they bring him in. Spear goes. He's got the power. He's a charismatic. You see what our author is saying to us by picking this story of David? He's the real deal. And he's the real deal as a kid. And then we get, well, now, the deity says to Samuel, yeah, Saul's just driving me out of my mind. I'm sick of persecuting that guy. Let's move on. I need someone else. Right? Very arbitrary. I don't know if I'd want to live in this world. So he says, go to this guy named Jesse. So they go, and Samuel walks up and he sees all the big brawny sons of Jesse. And he said, oh, it's got to be that one. He's in the world of charismatic religion. It's got to be that guy that looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's got to be the one. Nope. 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 And then Samuel said, oh, God, man, bad trip. You got any other kids? He said, well, I got the runt of the litter, but I usually don't take him out. I usually keep him in the back with the sheep. That tells me, now, why did our author pick that? Or why did our author shape the story this way? Because David, in this instance, doesn't fulfill the charismatic ideal. So even right here, that's not what I expected. And then we get another story our author pulls in, which if you read it closely, you'll see these two stories. They're in sequence, but they've come off a shelf someplace because of the Goliath story. Saul doesn't know David again. What do you mean he's been exercising you for the last few years? Didn't you open your eyes? So our author's pulled some traditions in. So now we want to ask ourselves as readers, if the story's theology, what's the point? And the point is holy war. This kid so fulfills the conditional covenant ideal that is a little whippersnapper. I don't know how they fought wars in this author's mind, because they're in a war and then he brings lunch. You have a lunch break? Is it a half hour? Do you get an hour? I mean, what are the Philistines doing? However that worked, what our author wants us to see is that David actually doesn't belong in this war. And he's not taken seriously. And when all the supposedly holy warriors don't really believe it, this little kid is so incensed by this giant, Rephaim, these are mean people, you don't want to run into them, that he is infused with the Spirit of God and kills him with a stone. So who is the character we're studying this week? John, can you come up with me? Who is this character? He's introduced to us as fulfilling the old age. He fulfills it. So what is that going to mean? We're not there yet. And I don't think our author would even be writing about him if the story ended here. I don't think our author would care. So anyhow, John, come back up here.
Wow, I don't have anything to say after
Oh, of course you do. Of course you do.
Well, Tom, thanks. The Holy War idea is fascinating, and thanks as always for bringing new light on a story that we've all heard all our lives. I kept thinking of as we were talking about Holy War, and I kept thinking about how religion and patriotism get mixed up so often, and how that's always pretty tragic. The armies of the Third Reich had a belt buckle that said, God with us, God with us. They were as sure that God was on their side as some of us probably thought God was on our side. So thanks for that warning. That always ends badly, so stay away from that.
Hey, John, can I say something?
Help yourself.
I'm so impressed by your leadership on that in your career.
Oh,
I never thought you bit that apple.
well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's a hard apple not to bite. Why don't you want your nation state to win, and why shouldn't it be for God?
Yeah.
New story.
I'll offend some people with this comment, but did you notice how after 9/11, unbidden, people started singing "God Bless America"? I'll never forget when we had a powerful interfaith service at Fort Church, and I thought did the best we could do to support people and support our nation. And at the end, after it was all over, some gentleman comes up in the front of the congregation and starts singing "God Bless America," and everybody stood up and sang. And we do believe God blesses America, but God doesn't have favorites. We're not the chosen nation.
This is a hard one, friends.
Right.
I'm at the end of my career. I have not figured this out, but this author wants us. This is why this story is still current. Now, we're not into the guts of the story, but our author does not want stereotypes. This is complex. All of it's real. How does it hang together? Doesn't it? A lot of my colleagues who work in the Deuteronomistic history think it's an incoherent story, that it doesn't cohere. And maybe that's the nature of religious experience. It just doesn't cohere. And you've got to stay the course. But
Tom, thank you. I'm going to make a radical proposal. We're exactly 10 minutes into the Bears game. I want to go home.